Welcome to our session, Sense and Sustainability. I'm Tom Fisher. I'm a professor in the School of Architecture at the University of Minnesota. I direct a center there, the Minnesota Design Center. I'm the former dean of the College of Design. I wear many hats because I'm also an author of 2 books on Salmela architects, as well as a client of one of the houses that you're going to see. So have many connections here. Really glad to welcome all of you to the Great Northern Festival. Every year, the Great Northern shares dozens of performances, art installations, outdoor activations, and solutions-focused climate talks during the last week of January and the first week of February that investigate mind and body. And before we continue, we wanted to acknowledge the Dakota peoples on whose land we are meeting and to thank them for their ongoing care of the land and acknowledge their connections to this community and the richness of their culture. I also wanted to thank Great Northern's Climate Series sponsors, the McKnight Foundation, the Minneapolis Foundation, on whose board I also sit, the Ascoff Finlayson, Polestar Minneapolis, and the Carlson Family Foundation for their support of these important conversations, in addition to the many organizations and individuals who contribute to the festival annually. If you'd like to support the ability of the festival to bring this free programming to all of us, please consider making a donation on their website, thegreatnorthernfestival.com. So unfortunately, David Salmela is ill today and was unable to join us in this conversation, but we're really pleased to have Kai Salmela here with us to talk about sustainability and design. Kai is an architect and designer whose 15 years of transdisciplinary experience in branding, environmental graphics, architecture, and master planning is unified by a deep interest in identity. His work has been recognized by industry organizations, including the AIA, AIGA, and SEGD. So please welcome Kai Salmela.
Hi. First, I'd like to thank Great Northern Festival for inviting us to this series on climate. Before we dive into the 3 projects that we're going to talk about today, with conversation with Tom, I wanted to first sort of talk about the Salmela architect firm kind of more globally in terms of how it ties to some of the larger goals of the Great Northern Festival and this talk series. Salmela architect is
Yes. Always the tech moment here.
Sorry.
What we're going
there
to
we go.
Oh, there you go. Got it? Yeah.
So Salmela architect has been referred to as a regional architecture firm, and I think that that description is accurate in a number of ways. This is a map of all of the 70+ projects, save 3, that Salmela architect has designed and built in the last 25 to 30 years. And as you can see, they're all in one region, which you could call Western Great Lakes region, the North, and you could I think there could be an idea that being a regional architecture firm is maybe not quite as prestigious or successful as being a national firm or an international firm, but I think there's an argument to be made that it's actually something to be proud of, and it's also a very sustainable way to practice architecture. For one, almost all of our projects are within a couple hours drive of either Minneapolis or Duluth, where we work from. There's also an efficiency to working regionally in that architecture is a very complex design process that involves a lot of different systems and overlapping considerations. And as you can see from this map, that it's an overlay of the hydrology, the ecology, and geology of this region. It's a very complex, rich area with a lot of different overlaying cultures and cultural practices. And so there's an efficiency to kind of designing in one region in that there's a lot of built-in knowledge of the people and places that inform and save time in the design process. And I guess the last point I would make is that even though it is all done in this one region, there's a richness, and there really no two places are alike. And there's a lot, you can spend much more of your design time really diving deep into the places and the people that you're designing for. So next I'm going to go through the three projects. These are three very recent projects, and they're all in the Twin Cities area. One just off of Lake Minnetonka, one in St. Anthony Park in St. Paul, an urban neighborhood, which is Tom and Claudia's house, and the third just north of Stillwater. And as you'll see, it's all, even within the same metropolitan area, they're all very different sites and very different clients that resulted in very different solutions. So I'll quickly kind of go through each project more experientially, how you would move through the space, how you would experience it, and then we can dive deeper into conversation with Tom. So these are the three sites: urban neighborhood in St. Paul, a 2-acre suburban site off of Lake Minnetonka, and then a 50-acre kind of rural site just outside of St. Paul. So as you can see, this project is in a sort of a denser urban neighborhood in St. Paul, a mixture of bungalows and four squares, and the neighborhood also has a lot of kind of mid-century modern homes. There we go. Some screen porches off to the side of the house, which function as the entrance and back screen porch. Approach the house, sort of a warm, welcoming entry porch to the right. You enter into a great room that includes the living space, dining area, and kitchen. The double height ceiling over the living space. The window on the right is actually a large picture window that looks back at the client's former house of 25 years, where their daughter now lives.
Yeah, exactly.
A very important feature. The two-sided screen porch, one facing the street, one facing the backyard. The upstairs hallway, which also functions as sort of a reading room, library. The main bedroom upstairs. The attic space that, through the addition of a dormer window, became maybe the most interesting space in the house, which is Tom's office. Okay, then the next project, Feldman's. This is a very different project, but much more stark and modern. It's essentially a black, elongated rectangle with some volumes kind of coming off the side and off the roof. Much more abstract and not necessarily clear where you enter the house, or no traditional cues. Cantilevering office space to the north. You can kind of see the narrowness of the I hit the wrong button. Oh, sure.
So we did not plan the technical glitch, but I have an announcement from the venue. So it's a reminder that Minneapolis put into place parking restrictions as of yesterday. So there's no parking on the even sides of the street on Oakland and 27th. So if your car is parked there, we'd encourage you to move it in case so it doesn't get towed. So I will go fix this, and that is a note for the room.
One of the great aspects of our house is that it enabled us to have both of our daughters and their families living on either side of us. So we live in a little family compound. It's been a great way to spend a pandemic.
So there's a screen porch off to the south, which is where you enter under the screen porch into the house. It's the entryway with a mudroom that sort of acts as both a front door and a back door. So there's opposite doors on either side with a shared mudroom. A sort of double height living room space, views to the lake in the distance, and a tall 30-foot chimney. A view up into the skylight. Also a kind of an open plan living space with kitchen, dining, and living room all in one.
With furniture that you designed, right?
Yes, with custom designed furniture. There we go. So the skylight is a central element. It both brings in sort of reflected light, but an interesting aspect to it is that one is facing east, one is facing west. And you can kind of see in this photo there's sort of a bluish light to the left and a warmer light to the right. And that sort of almost becomes a Turrell-like art installation where one light is warm in the morning when it's facing the sun, and then slowly it inverts from sunrise to sunset. It's sort of an even colored light at noon. A bedroom is the interior of the screen porch, which doubles as a bedroom in the summer and an extension of the upstairs living room space. And then an important aspect is the outdoor spaces as well. So we have a terrace facing south into the sun, as well as a terrace to the north. So depending on the season and whether you want the added warmth or the shade, you always have a place to go outside. And the office space facing the lake. And finally, the Goodwin Nakajima residence in Stillwater. This is a 50-acre site. It was actually being eyed for sort of a subdivision development. The clients the husband, Paul, had grown up in Hudson, Wisconsin, so this was sort of home to him. He had met his wife in Japan, where they had lived and had 2 children. So they moved back to the Twin Cities a number of years ago and were looking for a place for their kids to grow up sort of surrounded by nature, kind of being outdoor focused lifestyle. And so they found this site, and they gave all but 3 acres of the land to the Minnesota Land Trust for permanent ecological restoration and preservation. And so this house was all about the landscape and experiencing the landscape and kind of drawing you out into the landscape whenever possible. So you can see the wetlands, you can see the St. Croix River. Every time I hit the laser pointer, I don't use that. Sorry about that. So so there's a wetlands that feeds into the St. Croix River. It's a very biodiverse area with great blue herons flying over every morning, and just a magical landscape. So this is the approach from the driveway. There's a 2-stall garage, and then on the right, and then another 2-stall garage on the left, which is actually more of a, call it the barn, which has landscape maintenance equipment, and because the clients were actually doing a lot of landscape maintenance as well, or not maintenance, but restorative work. And so it sort of forms this gateway to this sort of interior courtyard. There's a giant Core 10 package mailbox that acts as sort of a threshold from the larger landscape into the smaller landscape of the courtyard. A few views of the courtyard. There's a guest house / office to the right, and then views into the larger field. So it's sort of this sequence of arrival. You enter into the house between these 2 blade walls. To the right is the mudroom. To the left is a kitchen, and we called this wing, there's essentially 2 wings of the house. This is the living pavilion, which is kitchen, dining, living. View from the kitchen, looking back through the courtyard and down the driveway. the dining space with views into the oak forest. And then there's a bedroom wing that's oriented perpendicular, which has 3 bedrooms and kind of a widened hallway that also serves as a family workspace. So all the kids do work there, the husband does work there, in addition to sometimes in the guest house. And it looks into the courtyard, sort of a more private view. Bedroom with a shower tub room that is inspired by Japanese, I think the term is ofuro. It's a traditional Japanese way of bathing. And then outdoor spaces underneath the cantilever. So this is looking south into the field. And then a view back from the field with deer bouncing across the frame. So I think, then we can start the conversation.
Yeah, great, Kai. We thought it would be good for all of you to see the images so that when we talk about them, you can kind of know what we're talking about. So, well, let's start to talk about the context for these 3. So one's urban, one's suburban, one's rural. From a sustainability point of view, let me ask you how much of that, those contexts sort of played into your design decisions, and how would you define them in terms of sustainability differently?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think when we start our design process, it's really thinking about the people and the place being both the site and the community, the culture of the community. And then there's the clients and their sort of desires. So and then when we think about sustainability, there really is not one optimized approach to achieving sustainability. There's, each context calls for something different. So, for example, with you and Claudia, you were living in an existing established neighborhood, in a neighborhood that you were already deeply embedded in. You had social relationships, and your goals were really to design a house that would allow you to age in place. Mm-hmm. As a place that you could. It's still a walkable neighborhood. It's there's sort of a sustainability to the denser urban development, right, and being able to use your car less and walk to things. But then the sustainability to designing for change so that you could actually age in place. And then the other thing was maybe one of the driving factors to the design was your own familial relationships with your daughters who ended up living adjacent to you, and wanting to keep that connection to your old house across the alley. So the whole house was designed to strengthen that relationship with your family so that you could watch over your grandchildren playing in the yard across the alley. Your children and your grandchildren could watch you. And so that is a sustainable, it's a sustainable thing to design a place that is able to change with the people who own it. Right. You're strengthening these community relationships, versus a project like I think the most different of the projects is the Nakajima Goodwin project, which we could fit, I think, 500 of your sites on their site. And does that mean yours is more sustainable or theirs? It doesn't. It's a completely different context. Their site is a rural site. The alternative was subdivision on this land that played a very important ecological role in the watershed. It was right above waterfalls leading into the St. Croix River. It had an amazing richness of plant ecology and animal species. So I think it was a very valid and a sustainable approach to purchase this land and preserve it for ecological function. And then to talk about the Feldman project is also, it's sort of in the middle in terms of size. It's a 2-acre lot near Wayzata. And so the story with that client is that they lived in the community. They lived in Wayzata in a much larger house, and she is an optometrist. He was a nuclear physicist, and they kind of realized that the house was much larger than they wanted and needed. It didn't have as much light because it was such a deep, wide house, and it required a lot of maintenance, and it was made with a lot of materials, a lot of materials that they had sort of health concerns about, like carpeting and synthetic products. And so their goal was to, with 2 kids, downsize to a house that was just the right size, not more, not less. This ended up being, I think around 3,000 square feet. By comparison, their previous house was, and the surrounding houses are 2 to 3, sometimes 5 times larger. So they wanted to sort of set up this as an example that you don't really need all that space, and they're concerned about not using toxic materials. So there really are not any toxic materials used in the house. All of the interior finishes is unfinished basswood. The floors are black slate. There's really almost no paint even. The insulation was mineral wool, so it's completely natural, non-toxic.
Right.
And then they wanted views to the exterior and sort of be more connected to nature and the climate and the weather, and not be sort of stuck deep inside of this large home that they weren't happy in. So those were sort of
Right.
The contextual considerations when we began the process.
I mean, living in one of your houses, it's always striking to us how during the day you don't need any lights on. There's so much light, and I think that that's true of all 3 of them. So talk a little bit about how you use daylight.
Yeah. So I think I would say daylight is and always has been the number one consideration when we're designing houses or other buildings. Daylight, the architects that have inspired David and inspired me are, a lot of Scandinavian architects, specifically Oliver Aalto, and sort of being in a northern latitude where daylight is both scarce at some times of year and plentiful at other times of year. You really sort of gauge the seasons through light. And so that's always been a consideration. And more recently, with sustainability and energy being kind of increasing concern in the last few decades, using the sun also for passive heating has also become something that we think about a lot. But so in terms of, I can refer to these projects. I think, let's go back to the plans. In a way, especially I would say the Goodwin project is a perfect example of how we designed and organized the spaces in the rooms to correspond with the daily and seasonal light patterns. So as you can see over here, there's sort of a north wing going north-south. So there's a long exposure to the east and the west. And all the bedrooms are facing east. So there was the idea of trying to the circadian rhythm and trying to link up the client's daily rhythms with the rhythms of the sun. So the sun comes up at a low angle, filters through the oak trees into their bedrooms, and kind of gently, slowly wakes them up in the morning. And then the south wing is oriented perpendicular, so there's a very long southern exposure. The breakfast table, there's actually a tall window that faces kind of northeast. So the light comes in the morning, shines on the breakfast table. In the afternoon, in the evening when you're sitting down, it's shaded. You don't want the afternoon sun because the house is already warm. And then with the south exposure, that really is an optimal orientation. It's actually it's slightly southeast, which is actually ideal solar orientation for passive heating. So in the morning and sort of up until noon, you're getting direct sun coming in and heating up the floor. In the winter, maybe I'll go to the next slide to show this. In the upper right corner, you can kind of see there's 2 arrows. The steeper arrow is in the summer. the eaves of the roof actually block the sun from coming in entirely because you don't want the added heating up the space. In the winter, when the sun angle is lower, the sun actually almost goes to the back of the room and will heat up the slate floor in the morning to the point where that thermal mass will keep that space warm the entire day without any additional mechanical heat. So that's sort of in the daytime you're getting in the living space you're getting both the heat and the daylight depending on the season, and then the two workspaces, which are the hallway off of the bedrooms and the guest bedroom that sort of semi-encloses the west side of the courtyard. Those are the two working spaces, and because they're facing west, they get no glare throughout the entire kind of the work hours of the day, which is ideal for if you're working at a computer screen. But then in the late afternoon, you start getting the sun starts kind of coming down, and it shines into the space, and it sort of signals that, okay, it's time to stop working, and it's time to go be with your family, and it's time to make dinner. Yeah. So all of these spaces are really oriented according to the sun and the patterns and the seasons. And actually, I guess we could talk about Feldman's next in terms of sun. Even though it's a completely different, I mean, there's a lot of similar ideas, even though it's a less traditional form. So you can see in the middle here at the bottom, the cantilever screen porch, not only, in addition to being sort of an outdoor shaded space to sleep on nice summer nights, it also acts very similarly to the eaves in the Goodwin project, where the big floor-to-ceiling windows are underneath this cantilever. So you likewise sort of are blocking the sun from coming in the summer and letting it in the winter. And then for your project was because of the sort of the driving force was sort of the social relationships. So it's sort of an inversion of the other projects and of more traditional houses. See, across the street from you also was a parking lot for a middle school. So there was much more desirable and important for you to have that relationship with your family than to kind of have the noise and the exposure of sort of this busy middle school across the street. So, and you were also much more interested in the idea of sort of energy independence or energy production. So because we couldn't really use the passive strategies of heating, and we really didn't want to. I think a lot of our projects maybe had too much light. I think your previous house was a little bit more of a traditional house. It had sort of a very soft, soothing light, and you didn't really want that sort of glare and more intense relationship to the sun. So all of those factors led us to sort of inverting the plan, focusing more on energy, capturing energy and using it to run the house in terms of electricity. So there's solar panels.
And why don't we talk about that for all three, the idea of sort of active solar energy kinds of things.
Yeah, yeah. So the form of your house is informed by both the sort of the typology of the neighborhood. They're all sort of gable roof structures. It's a St. Paul neighborhood. There's sort of there's an appreciation of historic architecture, even more so maybe than Minneapolis, I would say. With some examples of architectural experimentation because of the history of the St. Anthony Park, and there's Rapson houses and modern houses. So your house had both the experimentation and sort of the traditional form, and so in the gable roof in your house speaks to both that sort of more traditional form as well as an optimizing of energy capture. So the angle of the south-facing roof is perfectly aligned with sort of the equinox of
9 and 12.
Yeah, yep. So it's 9/12 pitch roof, which is the most efficient slope at this latitude for solar panels, and that really that sort of drove the form, and it really enables sort of you to be largely energy. You're producing almost all of the energy you need for your house through those solar panels, and so that sort of offsets maybe not capturing the sun for heat, and really capturing it and manipulating it more for this sort of tranquil, calming, psychologically beneficial quality of light. And you can kind of see, yeah.
And we cut the gas line off at the street, so there's no
Yes.
fossil fuels in
Yes.
it either, which we were concerned about indoor air quality issues.
Yep. So yeah, those were the two factors: the fossil fuel free, the aging in place,
Right.
which we can talk about later. But and so these diagrams kind of, I think the other thing to talk about in terms of light is there was sort of a desire, because it is a tighter, your neighbors are quite close to you, and there was a desire to focus on getting views of the mature oak trees and nature, and less looking directly into your neighbor's kitchen or living room or bedroom. So the strategy that we used was we sort of created this double height space, and the vast majority of the windows are on the upper level, but we are able to bring light down through this double height space, and you're getting light from the east and the west, which is, if it's direct light, it sort of can be very harsh in the morning,
Right.
but we got around that by reflecting that light off of surfaces and to kind of create a diffused, almost museum-like lighting quality rather than the direct kind of intense light. And it does have a very nice quality to the spaces.
While we have this slide up, also talk about ventilation. You've shown sort of those strategies here.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah, so passive ventilation kind of goes along and is in a lot of ways necessitate, or the passive heating sort of necessitates a passive ventilation, or they go together, I think, very well. And even without the passive heating, it's a strategy that we've always used, giving the owners and the users of a building the ability to manipulate their interior environment, sort of empowers people to be aware of the weather, be aware of the climate, be aware of how their house works and the sort of the thermodynamics, which is sort of antithetical to other strategies, which might be to really create a building that's hermetically sealed, that's all mechanically driven, that there's sort of a detachment with the environment. And so we kind of the two main passive ventilation strategies that we use are cross ventilation and stack ventilation. So cross ventilation occurs when you essentially have two windows opposite each other that allow the wind pressure to sort of draw air through the building and take out old stale air and bring in fresh air. And then stack ventilation really uses the properties of hot air rising to draw air upward and out. So on the Goodwin project, we have ample opportunities for both. We have operable windows on every exterior wall, and then we have, especially in the south-facing living pavilion, which is getting all of that direct sun, we have 3 large skylights that if there's too much heat in the space, you just open the skylights, and very quickly that heat just escapes. Sometimes even in the winter you might need to do that because there's so much heat from the sun coming in. So similarly, in the Feldman project, we have these 2 large skylights, and then this wood burning chimney, kind of are the core of the house, and light is coming in from above, and simultaneously heat is kind of going out from below. And also on your house also has operable windows are a central part of our design.
Yeah. Let's talk about materials, using local materials and low maintenance materials, particularly the Feldmans, where
Yep.
they didn't want any toxic materials.
Yeah.
But all 3 projects really have interesting material choices that
Yep.
have a sustainability component to them.
Yeah. So I'll start with Feldman's because that was sort of a driving factor to the design. So yeah, I think part of being a regional architecture firm is we're very deeply connected with the landscape, the materials that come out of that landscape, the craftspeople and the skills that are available in the region. And so whenever possible, our material strategy is quite simple, and it's to try to use local projects or local materials whenever possible, non-toxic materials whenever possible, low maintenance materials. And I think this is a perfect example. The floors are not a local product. They're slate from Vermont, a black slate, very hard, durable. They don't chip. They'll last 100 years. There's no sheetrock in this entire house. It's all basswood, tongue and groove boards. And basswood is a local material. It's considered a very sustainable wood. It's kind of maybe considered sort of more of like a junk wood. It's not. It's
Right.
we would build models in architecture school out of basswood. So it's not a material that's used all that. It's not like an oak or the woods that are typically used.
Right.
So it's and I think from a forestry forestry practice, it's also a sustainable wood. And rather than staining it or putting a toxic finish on it, it's just left natural, and so it's just raw wood. And we use raw wood all the time, especially basswood, but we use raw cedar all the time on exterior cladding. Like Wild Rice Retreat in Bayfield, Wild Rice Restaurant, that's 25 years old. It's all unfinished wood, and it sort of it ages, and it patinas, and it shows the weather. But it's it's a healthier way to build. Let's see, what other materials can we talk about?
Well, and local products too.
Local windows. Local, yeah. So that's the other thing. Minnesota is, in terms of building products, is a very rich. It's a rich history and a lot of really high quality windows, for example, because of the history of white pine, the quantity of white pine. A century ago, there's a lot of great window manufacturers. Marvin, for example, is being a particular example that everyone would know. And then H Window, which we use a lot, which is based in Ashland, Wisconsin, a Norwegian design, a Norwegian owner, but they're manufactured and based in Ashland, Wisconsin. And they're very high-performing windows for this climate. They're very structurally rigid, very airtight, made with it's basically wood, aluminum clad, and glass. So there's not, and then they have a special hinge that allows them to be cleaned from the interior. So from a maintenance standpoint, you can clean, a second-story window from inside and not have to get up on a ladder and have the risks involved with that. And then we've started using thermally modified wood, which is a Finnish technology that was developed in Finland, but arbor wood based in Duluth, which we have a long relationship with. They also own Epicurean cutting boards, Lal furniture, and so they've developed this a process, a manufacturing process for thermally modifying local woods so that they can be used on exterior without decay. So rather than having to use cedar, you can use pine even. To you basically cook the resins in the wood, and it makes the cellular structure of the wood rigid so that it can actually hold water. Water just sort of wicks through. So that's it's the price is there's an added price to it because there's more manufacturing involved. But with the cost of cedar, it's actually becoming comparable. So there's a rich history of material science and product manufacturing and sourcing of materials, all within this region.
Yeah, and then local contractors too. You tend to work with the same contractors over and over.
Yeah, yep. So I think that's being a regional firm and starting on initially on the Iron Range and then Duluth, and now I work in Minneapolis. We've developed relationships, very close working relationships with contractors, with tradespeople. So there's a contractor in northern Minnesota called Rod and Sons Carpentry. It's a family business. It's really almost going on 3 generations now, based in Gilbert, Minnesota, kind of north of the Iron Range. And they've built a large number of the northern Minnesota homes. And then, down in the Twin Cities, we've worked with Streeter several times, a really high quality builder.
And
Cates, based in Stillwater. We've worked on. Well, they've built a lot of the projects in Jackson Meadow. They built your house. They built the Goodman Nakajima house. So yeah, the way we tend to work is sort of, we like to develop relationships with builders, and with clients in a way that's it's sort of a collaborative process and a cooperative process more than it is a competitive or adversarial process, which sometimes happens. And so most of our contracts, most of the building contracts are open book contracts where the contractor is very transparent about their labor and material costs. And what that does is it enables them to get involved earlier in the design process, and sort of develop that a working relationship that's really about everyone coming together to build this thing to everyone's mutual benefit, rather than putting in a huge amount of effort up front in order to then be able to bid it out competitively to 5 firms, and that gets there's a huge amount of work in order to ensure that everyone is pricing every single thing exactly the same. So it saves money. It saves money, a lot of time, and it fosters sort of these positive relationships rather than sort of these adversarial relationships.
Yeah. And we found that bringing the contractors hot coffee and brownies, donuts in the morning really brings them along. Thanks to Claudia, my wife.
Yeah.
Before we open it to the audience for questions, I just wanted to also ask you a little bit about the landscapes around these houses.
Sure.
Because you use a lot of kind of native grasses. I mean, our front lawn has got native grasses in it. So you could talk a little bit about the immediate context around the house.
Okay, yeah, I guess we could start with your project, and an aspect that we haven't talked about, which is that we reused a foundation for your house. Your house, there was a Sears Roebuck house on the site.
700 square foot.
700 square feet. And going back to sort of working regionally and the problems with things like prefabricated housing, or the idea of making architecture, turning it into a product that can be sold the same thing everywhere. Right. Sears Roebuck being a perfect example. You buy a house out of a catalog, and it's the same house whether it's in Arizona or in Minnesota. And so the roof structure was failing. Right. All of the it was sagging in between each joist because it was understructured for the snow loads, and so that caused damage, and it was really more money and effort to try to rehab that than it was to build new.
And we deconstructed it too. So we took it apart rather than just
put it in
a landfill.
Yeah, put it in a landfill. Right. And so we were able to reuse the foundation, which was very 1 foot thick poured concrete. And not only did that save on materials and energy and time, it enabled the existing landscape to remain intact. If we had demolished the foundation and disturbed the site, there would have been 3, 4, or 5 trees that would have very mature, beautiful, healthy trees that would have had to have been torn down, and it would have created a hole in the neighborhood in terms of the canopy.
Right.
So I think that, and then our strategy then after it was built was really to kind of bring, and I would say our landscape strategy in general is sort of to try to restore it or make it sort of a native landscape, make it feel like we really didn't do anything,
Right.
especially in like the cabin setting, in more rural settings where you're up against the forest. Just basically bringing the native plants back in as much as possible. So yeah, for your project, that was, the reusing the very small footprint,
Right.
but then cantilevering the joists 2 feet on either side in order to turn a 700 square foot main floor into
Almost 900.
almost 900 square foot main floor. That fulfilled one of your primary concerns, which was how to put all of your living spaces on one level, just by cantilevering 2 feet.
Right.
So sort of adapting to the site, adapting rather than imposing, a new thing on a site that maybe wouldn't be conducive to it. We are listening to the site, listening to the context, listening to your requirements, and coming up with creative solutions that really would only be possible if you're actually thinking about it as an existing condition rather than as a blank slate.
Right.
We could talk. So then the Goodman project. This photo was taken before all of the restorative work had been completed, but the site includes sort of a sloping hill with oak forest, a wetland, a stream, a waterfall further down, and then these 2 former agricultural fields. And as part of the sort of agreement with the Minnesota Land Trust is that this field was sort of essentially scraped clean of invasive species and restored to native prairie land. And then the courtyard was sort of viewed. And I guess the other thing I should talk about with this project and sort of the configuration, Paul, having grown up in this contact very close to the site, he was interested in sort of roaming the landscape and letting his kids roam the landscape free. His wife, this was a very foreign place for her. She had grown up in, her parents actually didn't believe that they had bought 50 acres of land, because that is it's probably bigger than it's probably multiple times bigger than the Imperial Palace in Japan, in Tokyo. So it was sort of a completely crazy idea for her that they were going to own this huge piece of land, and it was sort of a scary idea of sort of living in this expansive landscape. So a big part of this project was trying to marry the place and Paul's sort of cultural background with Yuko's concerns and sort of about living in this sort of open landscape. So there are a lot of some Japanese references. So the covered walkways being one of them. She really wanted the wood slats, which is something that we sort of borrowed from Oliver Alto, but Oliver Alto actually borrowed that from Japanese architecture. So there's sort of there are these cultural links as well. It's and there's sort of a discussion across cultures, and I think that some of that is explored here, where I think there's both some Japanese references and maybe even like with the shed roofs, some Midwestern agricultural references, and sort of tying those things together into a home that felt like home to both of them. And so the courtyard was a way to create a more private exterior space. And then the other important thing was that she does most of the cooking, and so that the kitchen has that big picture window looking into the courtyard and looking beyond the courtyard to the driveway. And so that's sort of the center of the home, and she would have views in all of these directions and sort of feel a sense of control and awareness of, if someone's coming, you can see them from far away, and sort of.
And yet the little cluster of buildings also sort of encloses you in this big landscape.
Yeah.
So you feel like you're almost in a little village.
Yeah, exactly. Yep,
rather
exactly.
than,
Yep.
being exposed.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. And it's sort of it also becomes sort of a microcosm of the larger landscape.
Right. Yeah. Well, we wanted to give you all an opportunity to ask us questions. So we'd love to hear any thoughts or questions that you might have. I don't know if there's a mic that's going around too. So does anyone over here, yeah, go ahead.
Well, so mineral wool isn't wool, but wool actually can be used as insulation. That is an option. It's not a, there's an expense to that. But I know it has been used, and I think James Dayton Design, I know, has done some houses with wool insulation, if I remember correctly. But mineral wool is really sort of, it's sort of like an extruded stone.
Well, it's mineral.
It's minerals, yeah. So it's sort of, it's almost like, if you're familiar with bat insulation, which is sort of like fiberglass, and it has sort of a felted quality to it. It's the same, rather than fiberglass, it's minerals, it's stone. And it's sort of almost like a scouring pad or like steel wool. It's kind of like steel wool, but stone.
Yeah. And then right behind you, go ahead.
Hi. I was wondering if you could address your mechanical systems and septic water, especially the project north of Stillwater, well systems and things like that, kind of what your trends are in moving forward.
So we, on the project near Stillwater, and in a lot of, and I would say is a pretty typical for what we like to do. And so for heating, especially with the passive, where we're using passive strategies, you can't rely just on passive in this climate. For heating, we'll do radiant floor heating. So it's, plastic tubing set in concrete with slate pavers over. And so what's nice about that, there's an efficiency to that, and that sort of the passive and the active kind of work together seamlessly. So the sun can come in, heat the slate, which then is stored in the concrete below it, and can kind of, it has an inertia. But if you need additional mechanical, let's say it's 30 below zero, the sun may not produce enough heat to heat that space during the day. You turn so this is a gas boiler that feeds the warm liquid that heats the slab. So that's how the heating works. The cooling, we like to use high velocity forced air for both cooling and for just sort of air movement. So there's an air to air heat exchange. So as you're mechanically exhausting air, you're taking the heat out of it and warming the new air that's kind of going to be supplied to the spaces. We also had, if I remember correctly, I think we had a heat pump, like a mini split sort of supplemental, which could be used in sort of shoulder seasons. So when it's not extremely hot or extremely cold and you don't need a lot of air conditioning or a lot of heat to heat the space, you could just use basically a heat pump to basically draw heat even out of cold air, using sort of the compression, the refrigeration compression cycle to draw heat out of the air and kind of put it into the space.
Yeah, we have a heat pump in our place too, and of course ours is solar powered. So we have a Tesla wall in the basement, a battery. So we run the house in the evening when the sun goes down off the battery, and then have a lot of equipment in our basement from Excel Energy. They have the ability to draw. We sell them power when we produce too much, and then they also can drain our battery in emergencies. So we're actually part of the grid. We're not off the grid. We're part of it.
Yeah, and generally electricity it's generally a little bit more expensive to use for heating, but because you are producing your own energy, it isn't more expensive. It's actually, it's cost effective.
Yeah, and then of course the house is heavily insulated too.
Yeah.
New windows. I mean, it really helps having a new house to do that with. Yeah.
Yep.
Can you describe your design process? I know design by committee usually doesn't work. I assume you're working with your dad on this. So from your perspective, and then maybe Tom, from your perspective, how you brought them into it, because obviously we have a strong design background too.
So design process usually starts with very long, maybe 3-hour-long meetings with clients. With Tom, we knew Tom.
We knew each other. Yeah.
So there was a lot of background there, but it starts just to get to know the people, not just spreadsheet how many square feet they need, but the point, the point of meeting for very long is really to talk about everything, to learn about the family, learn about what they do, learn about what they like, what their background, their culture, and it's really in just listening to and getting a sense of not just the numbers and the obvious questions, but what are the stories in their lives that really they identify with? What are the mythologies, that what is the world that they live in? And then once we kind of get to know what they need, what they want, understand the site, understand. I think the Goodwin Nakajima project was a perfect example, because they had worked with a different architect and they just weren't getting anywhere. And we met with them, I think, the first time on site, and the first question David asked was, "What do you want to see when you wake up in the morning?" And he's like, "Wow, no one asked us that." Yeah. When the previous architect didn't really ask us that question, and so it was, and he was an amazing client because this was like his dream project. He actually, I would say, every week during the design process when the weather was still nice, he was camping on the site. And so he really understood, and he knew where the blue herons would be in the morning and where they would go in the afternoon and where the deer would hang out. And so he was very influential and critical to the design process. It wasn't us imposing our ideas on him. It was us drawing out from him the things that he already knew, and maybe didn't even know that he knew. So ultimately, the center of the living room was right where he put his campfire, because he intuitively knew where he wanted to be on the site, and there was actually there was if you look at the topography, there's a reason why he was there. He wasn't analyzing it like a landscape architect or a surveyor. He was just living in the landscape intuitively, and he intuitively picked this spot. And it was actually a great spot because it was there was a lot of subtleties to the terrain, and this was sort of a little plateau before it sort of went down the slope, before the hill kind of went up to another hill. So it was, it's sort of drawing out things from the client. And if the client, reacts negatively to something, it's not us trying to force our ideas on them. The reason they're reacting negatively is because something doesn't feel right, and they may propose a solution which maybe isn't the right solution for the problem that they're sort of trying to voice. But it's trying to suss out what it really is that they're not liking, and then coming to modifying it accordingly.
Yeah, in our house, the design started more like the Feldman house. It was kind of it was sort of boxy, and it didn't quite fit right in that neighborhood. And we got a bid on that sort of first schematic design that was too high. So actually, David turned that project over to Kai and Claudia and I started working together on it, and got it in budget, fit on the site, but it was a very different. The house ended up being very different from where it started.
Yep.
And we had this idea of, because of the solar angles and all the gable roofed houses around it, to basically create a little gable roofed gray box with windows kind of placed where they needed to be to block views or to gather light rather than line it all up. And the idea was that nothing would line up. And that actually made it really flexible. If you're not trying to line anything up, you can put it wherever it needs to go. And then we had this idea of popping all the windows out for window seats and certain rules, like all the windows are square, just to sort of give some order to it.
Yep.
And it was fun. We had this process where you would send us drawings, we'd mark them up and send them back to you, and we just went back and forth like that for many months.
Yep.
Anyway, it was a fun process.
Yeah. So, and talking about, you asked about the relationship between myself and David. I think, it sort of depends on the project. Some projects, we both sort of work on the design phase. Some projects I sort of just take over and work on, and doesn't mean that he's not involved. I still talk to him and kind of get his reaction. But it sort of depends on the project and what makes sense. Like the Goodwin project, Goodwin Nakajima, I would say it was pretty even. We were both designing simultaneously. Certain things, a lot of the interior stuff he designed. The actual configuration in the courtyard was a later change that I made based off of trying to make it a little bit more passive friendly, and so there was. It's I would say in general it's a very collaborative process within the office and also with the clients and with contractors too, because contractors, the typical process is the architect works out every single detail from start, and that before they even show it to the contractor. But contractors also, we listen to them, and tradespeople too. If there's a better way to do it than what we drew, I think giving everyone a stake in the project and allowing them to be creative makes the project better. So it's sort of a living process from start to finish. It's not you design it and then you execute it. It's sort of the whole thing is design.
And speaking of a living process, we're out of time. So thank you, Kai. This was great fun. And we just want to encourage everybody, you're encouraged to stay the whole day, to visit Fika downstairs. There's food as well as a coffee bar outside. And they ask that if we stick around and chat, we have to do so downstairs. So thank you all for coming. And thanks again, Kai. This was fun.